Hi.
Hi, I see you. I just got your email. I'm Casey. That said
I
you were
just
having
sent
trouble
it.
getting
Hi,
in.
Casey. Yeah, well, I'm here. I thought I was
Oh,
following the instructions right. It doesn't matter. I'm here now.
that is great. I'm gonna let people stay in the waiting room for a minute because I know that you and I haven't connected, and I'm here for you. I was gonna stay off camera and just keep you spotlighted, unless, yeah, you would like me to be on there with you for whatever reason. And I didn't know if you wanted me to introduce you or if you just kind of want to open it up and kind of just start rolling.
Um, if you want to do a super quick introduction, that's okay. And then I just like as a kind of like here we go thing, and then
Yeah.
I'm gonna intro who I am and how I came into this work, switch over to the slideshow, run through that. And then I think I had originally told Emily that maybe we do Q&A throughout the slideshow, which is something I like to do in person, but I think that might be a bit chaotic. So after the slideshow, I figured we would switch into the Q&A and then into the activity. But I think that the Q&A and the activity will probably be a little bit organic. Like we might go back and forth. I might pull some other images and screen share them once we're doing the activity, that sort of thing.
Okay. And I think that with the webinar, the way that this is set up, I'm going to tell people when I introduce you to write their questions in the chat or to raise their hand after a certain amount of time, because I do not see the Q&A button at the bottom of our screen.
That's fine. That's fine. Let me test my screen share here. All right.
I see it.
And does that look okay? Full screen for
Yes.
you?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I'll to be honest, I'm going to be kind of running the activity a little bit seat of the pants because I don't know what people are going to bring, and I guess there's a possibility people won't bring anything. So talk through
Yeah.
things, but I kind of figured it would be um like I brought a thing to talk about if no one else wants to talk about it, or I could talk about other exhibit strategies that I'm interested in. But hopefully we'll get a bunch of talkers and 2 hours will blow by pretty quick. We'll
I
see.
hope so.
We'll see.
Yeah, and if not, it is up to you to kind of gauge that. I don't know how many people have registered or will come, or, it's been different every single session that we've had. I think some of it has to do with just time of day. So you feel free to, yeah, to play that one by ear.
Okay. Okay. Um,
And you just let me know too. We have 2 more minutes. I'll let you know when I start letting people in. I figured we'll just give us a minute. But what I was going to do is just use the bio that we have that you sent.
mhm.
Yeah, I don't know if
Totally
there's
fine.
anything. Okay.
It's totally fine. Yeah, and as short as you want to be, and then I'll probably end up repeating some of it, but it'll just give me a second to take a breath, and then then we'll go. I'm
I'm
oddly
interested to hear what Justseeds Artists Cooperative is.
Oh, okay. I'll try to remember to talk about it. I'm oddly nervous, Casey, to be honest with you. I
Oh,
do I do presentations all the time, and this one I'm like, oh, boy, the stakes feel kind of different. But I don't usually like it's been a while since I taught or like kind of had a more interactive object-based thing in front of me, and it's on Zoom, so there's like some unknowns,
I
but
know
it'll be
Zoom
fun.
does do weird things for you, huh?
Yeah, I
But
was
you'll be
holding an
great.
object up to see if the camera got it, and I was like, oh, the background is maybe a little bit like, it's just different. It's a different world. We're all
I don't
used to it.
Do not worry about it. It's going to be great. All right, well, take a deep breath. I'm going to let everybody in. It looks like there's
All
six
right.
people here right now, and I'm sure more will join. Hello, everyone. I would love to see your faces or just a thumbs up if you can hear us and see us. Can you all hear or see me who's talking? All right. Hi. Welcome, welcome. I hope you all were able to see our keynote speakers just a few minutes ago. They had some interesting stories to share. I'm going to give us just another minute to let people come in before we get rolling. All right, I am Casey King. I'm here with the Central Appalachian Network, who's co-hosting the Big Ideas Festival. And I would like to introduce you all. I thank you all for joining us. I want to introduce Shaun. I didn't even double check how to say your last name, Slifer.
Slifer works, yeah, yeah.
What would you say?
I usually say Slifer, but I don't correct people because it feels wrong too. So Slipper would be okay if you.
Okay, well, I'm glad that I got it right. Shaun is the director, the creative director at the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, even though I think you're coming to us from Pittsburgh, aren't you not? Or are you
I
not?
am in Pittsburgh, yeah, yeah.
But he designs and builds all of the exhibitions grounded in a collective vision of the museum's team. He is also the lead designer on the museum's community-based Courage in the Hollers public monument project and currently serves as the ad hoc collections manager, collecting our artifacts and developing online exhibits. And so I'm going to let Shaun take it from here and lead you all through what he plans on doing today. And if you all would like to ask a question, you can use the raise your hands emoji or put it in the chat. And then I know that Shaun's going to answer some questions and also has an activity for everyone kind of closer towards the end of the workshop. Okay, go for it.
Cool. Thanks for coming. My name's Shaun Slifer. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself for a minute, and then I'm going to talk about like sort of just how I came into this work. And then I'll talk to you guys about the museum and how the museum formed, how some of the exhibits came together, and how we work collaboratively on those. And then after that slideshow, we'll do a Q&A, and then I have a kind of loose organic activity for us to try to do, and we'll see how that goes. So um, so I identify as an artist primarily. I grew up in Nebraska and moved to Tennessee when I was 15, lived there for about a decade before I moved to Pittsburgh, and moved to Pittsburgh in 2004. I say all of that so that you guys understand why I have no Appalachian accent whatsoever. When I first started working in Southern West Virginia, like two words would come out of my mouth and people would be like, "Where are you from?" Um, so I identify as an artist. I did go to undergrad and study art when I lived in Nashville. I came to history work as a sort of street level activist, like doing a lot of anti-war work and a lot of work with unhoused people in Nashville. And really, even though I didn't have a background in academia and didn't really have a background in history, and really honestly was a terrible student the whole time that I was in public school, I started kind of teaching myself history by reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, and things like that. But I don't identify as self-taught. I identify as community taught, by which I mean like I am in community with a lot of academics. I'm in community with a lot of people who are in various positions in terms of how we have all learned to share history. Some very scholarly, some more like oral history traditions. Um, and I came to the work at the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum from kind of a couple of places. One is that I was sort of peripherally involved in the anti-mountaintop removal movement. I say peripherally because I wasn't really doing much, but a lot of people I was very close to were very deeply involved in it. I went to the 2011 March for Blair Mountain, which a friend of mine kind of convinced me to come down to. It was, if you don't know about it, it was like a 5-day march along the 50-mile route that the Redneck Army took to get to the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921. And we were marching in support of unions, and there was a kind of attempt to bring organized labor and ecological concerns and community concerns together in an action that I was really curious about. It was very hot in West Virginia that summer. That was the first time I'd been down to Southern West Virginia and really kind of immersed myself in this stuff. I was meanwhile getting by as a wage laborer in the museum sector up here in Pittsburgh. And I was an installer, an exhibit installer, which sounds potentially really cool, but it's also usually the very bottom rung of the museum hierarchy. So no one had ever really asked me what I thought about anything. It was just my job to rotate different galleries and museums, get paid as a contractor doing this work. So when I found out about the beginning of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, which came partially out of the anti-mountaintop removal movement, there was this historical interest that I had, and also this experience that I had actually physically building things that brought me to it. So does anybody have any questions before I dive into the slideshow? I'm not monitoring the chat. That's Casey. I'm going to dive in then.
I think feel free to dive in.
Diving in. Full screen for you guys.
It looks good.
Okay. Well, you know what? I'm going to put it on. I'm going to take it off of the slideshow for a second here and just get myself a full screen view instead. And start over. Okay. If you haven't been to the museum, can you guys see this okay?
You are no longer sharing
I'm
it.
no longer sharing. Classic mistake. Okay, here we are. We're looking at a picture, right? This is where we are in West Virginia. You guys probably know this or know the region to some degree, but when I give presentations outside of Appalachia, I always have to stress exactly how rural our museum really is. We're in the southern coalfields. Mate 1 is, if you've not been there, right across the river from Kentucky. It's a fairly small community that this is kind of the downtown area where most people don't live here, but this is the area surrounded by the flood wall. And that's actually the United Mine Workers' current union hall. We are one of the only museums I know of that has an integral relationship with an active current labor union. There are some unionized workers in the museum sector around the country, and there are some museums that have been started by unions, but we have worked directly with United Mine Workers Local 1440 since the beginning in 2014. And that's very unique. Also, I think I talk to a lot of audiences that are not at all used to this kind of collaboration. We talk about coal mining a lot, obviously, and we do a lot of work to talk about what the labor of coal mining is. But as you guys might know, there's a lot of coal mining museums. So we need to establish for people that walk in, especially if they're not from the region, what it was like to live in a coal mining community and why those conditions led to the mine wars part of the title of the museum. So we talk in the early exhibits and have always talked about company towns and how these places were, how almost every mine in the region was settled essentially by a company that then stepped in and built fairly identical housing. This large picture is of Itman. This is a particularly palatial company store, but you know, you would basically you would live in a company home. You would get paid in company scrip. This is some scrip coinage from our collection. Um, you would only be paid in that scrip for your work, and that scrip was only redeemable at a company run store in the town, which locked you into a system of servitude because you could not take any money that you earned, for example, and move to another town with it because it was all in private currency, which was functionally illegal for several decades before West Virginia started doing it. If you started to unionize in the southern coal fields, you would be very quickly kicked out of your company owned housing. And so these tent colonies sprung up that were largely supported by the United Mine Workers, by which I mean they would actually buy the tents and try to find private land for people to be able to camp on. And people would sometimes live entire families for months up to a year through all the conditions and all the seasons in these canvas tent colonies. West Virginia is not the only place that this happened. Some of the tents from the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes actually ended up going to Ludlow, Colorado in 1913. The actual tents themselves were shipped out there. So there's you know a lot of this kind of action throughout the United States, but Southern West Virginia is very unique in terms of the length of time that it took to unionize those coal fields. All of this was policed by the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. Up here in Pittsburgh, we had the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which actually still exists. Down in southern West Virginia and parts of Western Virginia, the Baldwin Felts Agency, which was employed in a couple of different things. One was guarding private railroad property, one was enforcing Jim Crow laws, and one was busting up unions by force. So, you know, I have a couple of artifacts off to one side here. The comic is from a fairly new graphic novel called Black Coal and Red Bandanas on PM Press, which I recommend. A photo from the movie Mate One, which I'll get to, and then an actual photo of them. These guys, you know, now I might not have said this a year ago, but I feel like these guys are kind of like operating in the way that ICE agents are operating now in the United States, in the sense that like they sort of operated extra legally. You know, they weren't police, they weren't required to identify themselves. They really were able to roll into communities and establish what the law would be. And the town that we're in, Matewan, is particularly special because it was the site of the Matewan massacre, which we actually call the Battle of Matewan in 1920. And this was a situation where the chief of police, Sid Hatfield, collected a bunch of residents of the town of Matewan and fought back against the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency after they came and evicted a bunch of people from the Stone Mountain coal camp, which was at the time right outside of the town of Matewan. We used to be in the building in this photo that has the awning kind of right dead center there. The building itself has been rebuilt since 1920, but that's the spot that we first started out in. And all of this was memorialized in John Sayles and Maggie Renzi's movie Matewan, which I want to say 1987 is when this came out. And the movie's great if you hadn't seen it. It's kind of a downer. It's got like it's about really hard times, but it's a very well done movie. And it came out at the time that a lot of mine wars history, which we'll get into this more, was actually starting to become more public than it had been since the 1920s. So a lot of these stories were really just kind of kept within the communities in which they happened, as well as being strategically suppressed from public school textbooks and other forms of state sanctioned history. Basically, I mean, I have a lot of feelings about how and why that happened, but it was essentially that you had this multi-ethnic, multicultural working class rising up against private industry. And that's not typically part of the story that we tell about the United States, right? And also, I think, like from a certain perspective, I think from the ruling class, it's not advantageous to talk too much about when people rise up, generally speaking. So 1987, this film comes out, and around the same time, um, the book Thunder in the Mountains comes out by Lon Savage. Not too long after that, several other sort of academic and scholarly books are coming out that are about the mine wars. So it begins to become more public. The events in 1920, the Battle of Matewan, the chief of police and his best friend and deputy, Ed Chambers, were killed the next summer, showing up to a courthouse on trumped up charges. And that was one of several kind of last straws for for the unionizing miners in the region at that time. So a very kind of loose group of miners started to congeal outside of Charleston in an area called Lenz Creek, close to the town of Marmet, and eventually began marching south. They were headed to Williamson, which was the county seat of Mingo County near Matewan, to, well, there's a number of reasons why they were marching besides just being pissed off, but they were going to free some of their comrades who were imprisoned there. And they clashed on the 13-mile Spruce Fork Ridge line, of which Blair Mountain is the southernmost part. So then that becomes the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, which was and still is the largest armed labor uprising in the United States history. There's not a lot of photographs of it, so we'll talk a little bit about telling stories when you don't have pictures of those stories. But this was a, very well trained but very diverse army of unionist coal miners marching south, wearing whatever they were wearing at the time, with red bandanas around their necks to identify them in the battlefield. But this earlier picture, I mean, a lot of these guys fought for the U.S. Army in World War I, and so they still had their doughboy helmets and their Springfield rifles, and they just wore those to battle along with their coveralls or whatever else. They came up against Baldwin Felts detectives, as well as a private militia that was formed by Don Chafin, who was the sheriff of Logan, the town of Logan, and basically in the pocket of the coal companies for many years. His primary task was keeping the Union out of Logan County entirely. And so he was kind of responsible for whipping up a vigilante army, bringing in volunteers, bringing the Baldwin Felts in, getting everybody armed. The U.S. Army eventually comes in and breaks this up, but airplanes are involved that Don Chafin has hired to drop homemade bombs on these miners in the mountains. This is national news at the time. I also like to bring this up because, if you're not from the region or you haven't lived in the region for a long time, you might not know that this was literally on the front page of the New York Times every single day as it was developing. So it was quite a feat to erase this from public memory shortly after it happened. If that history lesson was either too vague or too thorough, it's because I have so many details about this stuff in my head that I tend to kind of breeze it, but happy to answer any questions about that, the history details, but I'm going to transition into the museum itself. This was our first building. We were in a small storefront that was next to a church in downtown Matewan. And we opened our doors in May of 2015. And this is what it looked like. When I first stepped into this work, the way that I describe it to friends and other audiences is that all of the people on the board, of which I think there were about 8 or 9 at the time, had a lot of good ideas and had done a lot of work to figure out what the museum was going to be, but they hadn't really figured out what would happen when somebody walked in the front door. And that's how I got roped into this. So all of a sudden, all of the work that I had done, from like learning how to frame to building exhibitions, building cases, getting lettering on the wall, building walls. You do a lot of drywall when you're building exhibitions for museums. All of that stuff came to bear. And at the same time as I had these skills and ideas, I'm also trying to figure out how to filter these stories that we want to tell through the objects that we have, bullet shells, for example, or company script, and the photographs that were available through the state archives and the West Virginia Regional History Center at WVU. So even though I did a crash course of like every book I could find about the West Virginia mine wars at that time that I hadn't already read, I was also trying to figure out how to bridge between like the scholars that were on the board and the local union guys, and figure out what everybody's priorities were and kind of pull everything together. Uh, and it was really hard. I felt like I used every single skill that I had, including what any organizer will tell you is like a critical skill, which is like your people skills, like your charisma, your ability to get along with people. All of that actually comes into play, whether you're organizing a union or your neighborhood or whatever. You kind of also have to be able to be somebody who gets along with everybody. This is the inside of the museum in its first iteration. And I look back on this because I'm going to show you pictures of the museum as it currently is, and it's very different. I look back on this and I understand a lot of what I was trying to do at the time, which was basically just create a space where the legitimacy of this people's history was asserted. You know what I mean? Like I think that people often see the presence of a museum that is about something as an assertion of the legitimacy of that thing. So that if the museum has a particularly like tight aesthetic to it or whatever, that kind of pushes that. Like I've been to some pretty wingnut museums that were just like huge collections of people's stuff all over the floor and ceiling and all over all the walls. And I love those spaces too, but you get a different feeling depending on how the spaces organized that you walk into. I was coming from I was coming from an art background, but when I worked in history museums, they were very clean and tight and very like careful in their presentation. And the idea that I had was to bring that kind of aesthetic into Mate One and just assert that the power of these stories was parallel to the power of the stories at the other history museums that I worked with. Because number one, I believed that, and number two, it just felt like the thing that made the most sense to try to do. Um, and you know, at the time, that meant like a lot of gray walls, and it was a very monochrome space to walk through, and there were little highlights of color here and there, but we didn't have a lot of space to work with, and we had no money. We had enough money to pay the rent on this storefront that we were operating in, but we had like a water heater in the back that was going to blow any day. We had crazy moisture problems. I didn't really get paid for this work. I was just volunteering. To me, as an artist, this was basically a giant sculpture, like an installation piece that people could learn from. And so I think sometimes it's a little weird to say, yeah, I'm an artist, here's my work, and then it's a history exhibition, but just to say that that's how I was tackling it. So the museum looked like how I just showed you for up until 2018, if I remember correctly. And in the summer of 2018, Chuck Keeney and I and a guy named Kenny King, who I'm going to talk about later, sat down and looked at this series of 7 photo postcards that Kenny had just bought off of eBay that were all shot by an unidentified photographer who had probably worked embedded with the US Army and showed up when the Army showed up to the Battle of Blair Mountain and took these photos of some of the settings. And Chuck and I had the idea that we wanted to extrapolate on the kind of synergistic relationship between the US military and resource extraction and US corporations in general, and talk about how that had happened 100 years ago, and push a little bit about how that how that often happens now. Although, like a lot of history museums, most of our story is in the past and not in the present. So we built this exhibit, Boots on the Ground, and that was the first one that where I broke out of the gray monochrome and really started thinking a lot with Chuck about like, what are some other things people want out of an exhibit? And what if we just kind of started mixing things up, and there were some things that you could touch and some, you know, a button that you could push to listen to. So that exhibit kind of broke the mold, but it wasn't until 2019 that Local 1440 bought this really large building that was across the street from where we had been for several years. And in negotiating to buy that building, they reached out to us and said, do y'all want to move into this building and expand your museum? And, you know, that at that time, my involvement in the museum was fairly minimal, except for boots on the ground, because it was kind of like the work was already done. But the board asked me if I wanted to come back in, and they were going to try to write some grants to move the museum across the way. The union guys at the time, I think their idea was like, yeah, we'll just pick everything up and walk it across the street one day, and then you can open the new museum across the street in a bigger building. But when we bought it, it still looked like a bank inside, and there was like a lot of work to do. But also, we were having a lot of conversations amongst ourselves about, well, what are the lessons that we've learned in the last few years about what we've done right, but also maybe what we've done wrong or what we wish we could have done. And we had a new director. We'd hired Mackenzie New Walker, who's still our executive director, and she was starting to bring in grant money, which, believe it or not, was a pretty new thing for us. Like, we ran for several years on very little, and she had some really powerful insights into like how we could grow this thing. So she jumped into the job and moved right into moving the museum into this other building and demoing everything. See if I have some demo pictures later, but demoing everything that was in the museum and redesigning it based on input from the board. So what I did was looked at the old blueprints that we had of the building when it was originally built, and I sketched out, we occupy the bottom front half of this building right now. We own the entire building. The union has sold it to us, but the museum itself is in the front bottom half of this. And I made drawings of that floor plan, and I brought them on big 11 by 17 sheets to a board meeting. We had a jar of markers, and I just said, everybody has to draw a floor plan. I don't care how good it looks. I don't, like, just, we have decided on this chronological sequence of the story already, which I'll show you some of. How would you fit that into this space? And so everybody kind of, drew what they thought. Some people would draw in a theater, some people would, didn't know what to do. It can be difficult to put art making materials in front of people that have convinced themselves that they're not artists, because people don't want to embarrass themselves, right? But we had all been working together for a long time, and I was, really pushing people. It doesn't matter how good you think it looks. And this design on the right-hand side of this image is what I came up with after filtering through a lot of these drawings in real time with everybody at that meeting, as well as challenging myself to have as few right angles as possible, which probably sounds ridiculous to you guys, but I just thought it would also be fun to kind of really break up the squareness of how the original space had been and how this room felt to me when I first walked into it. So that's an aerial view of the walls that we first built out as I was first painting them in. You can see now I also got like deep into this kind of subdued rainbow color for all the exhibitions to further delineate like which sections you were standing in when you were there. These walls were built by a crew through Coalfield Development, by the way. So this was an interesting opportunity for us to work with them for the first time. They do a lot of work training and that kind of stuff. And they brought some guys in who fully framed out and drywalled this, although they then left, and I did all the mudding of the seams, which if you've ever done drywall is like quite a bit of sort of sculptural work, trying to make the seams look good. And this is what it looked like at home. So I haven't talked about this much, but I live in Pittsburgh. It's about a 7-hour commute for me to get down to Mate One when I do come down. So I'm doing a lot of this kind of work, this imagining what's happening at home. And this is actually a different wall of the attic that I'm in right now as I'm talking to you, that I pasted all of these things up on and kind of kept myself a work calendar. I think we built the first museum in about a year total, although the final installation of all of the photographs and objects and everything was a 2 or 3 week period in April and May of 2015. This process took from, I think we got the keys to the building in late 2019 and started ripping up tile and trying to get the carpet down and get the walls built and everything. And then we were going to open in May of 2020, but of course in March of 2020 the pandemic hit. That threw everything off for quite a while. I started coming back down to work that summer when most people were sort of sheltering in place. Although in Mingo County, there weren't really very many COVID cases, so it was a bit abstract to folks. But in retrospect, I'm like the only person I know who was traveling regularly at that time, because I was going down to Mingo County every other week or so. So this is what it looked like at home with all my paint swatches and notes. And this is what it was looking like down in Mingo when I came down there to work on the construction stuff. And this was very much like all hands on deck at the time, and the initial kind of get the plywood down, level out the floor, get like the base coats of paint up. These guys with the union local are just like ready to show up with a hammer and destroy something or throw something up. Like they work very quickly. They're very engaged with it. And then once we got all that stuff up is when the deeper work started of actually fine tuning everything. I'll run you through the exhibits fairly quickly, and then we can kind of come back to some examples of specific objects within them if you guys want to talk about that some more. But like I said, it's chronological. So you enter into this life in the coal camps area, and that whole section is about, you know, work life and domestic life in the southern West Virginia coal fields. I kind of want to talk a little bit. I'll back up. This thing on the left side, as we talk about objects as storytelling tools later, I'll reference this, but those are check tags, which were part of a system for both checking out tools on a pegboard on your way into a mine, and also for the people who were kind of managing the mine on any given day to understand, based on the number on the tag, who was down there with tools, or also, I mean, it varied a little bit, who may still be down there working. And when your cart of coal that you had mined came up from the mine, your check tag would be on that cart so that you would be logged for that amount of coal to be paid for once it was weighed. And we have a lot of these check tags. They're basically just these little brass discs that have a hole punched in the top and a number stamped on them. And the numbering system is just particular to whatever mine they came from. And we had a lot of these things in our collection. And so there's a kind of half version of it off to the side. Chuck and I were trying to figure out how to represent numbers with some of the things that we had a lot of that single object, because no one really wanted to look at just a bunch of these check tags in a pile. And we started talking about the Monongah disaster in 1908, which killed, I think it's like 317 miners. And so when we hit on the Monongah disaster, we thought, you know, it would really be something to have people walk into this exhibit. You can see it now on the left. Right when you walk in, we're talking about the lethalness that working in the coal mines, how lethal it could be to work in the coal mines. So there's one tag on the wall for everybody who was killed in that explosion. And the quote up top, each one of them represents a man, is actually just something that one of our board members said one day when we were talking about check tags. He didn't say it to be profound. He just said it. And we put it on the wall because it felt resonant to me. We walk people into the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes, which is kind of the beginning of the West Virginia mine wars. There we have the first of our oral history stations where you can listen to audio. We have this tent that my partner actually made this tent. She's very good with textiles. There was a lot of research involved trying to figure out like, where do these canvas tents actually come from in the early part of last century? And then, like, just who was making the tents? What did they actually look like? And then how can we build one that is like historically accurate, but also small enough to fit into the museum? If you remember from the photos I showed you earlier, it's the same tent that's kind of like crushed into a corner of a wall. It is accurately the smallest size that they had. This was basically like a Boy Scouts kind of pup tent style thing that existed at the time, but a lot of the tents that whole families lived in were larger. But you can go into that one. We have personal artifacts. These are from Frank Keeney, who was a very powerful militant union organizer at the time. People walk through a very short section that's about World War I and also about like what were West Virginians doing at that time, who served, who stayed in the mines, how much more dangerous it was to work in the coal mines than it was to be in the US Army at that time. As well as something that's a little bit more difficult to pinpoint, which is what other kinds of working class revolutionary movements were operating in the world at the same time as Central Appalachian coal miners were doing the radical thing of demanding human rights in the coal fields. When we talked about designing when I showed you that drawing of the layout of this new space, the plan had been to cover all the windows that the bank had, at least in this space, because two reasons. One, I like to work in a dark space. Like, I like a museum that's darker and has pinpointed lighting, but also specifically to textiles and paper, which we don't have a ton of. You want to keep UV light off of those objects from a conservation standpoint. So I wanted to cover the windows up and kind of control the space. However, one of our team members at that time, who grew up and still lives in Matewan, was like, that one window in the corner over there is like, if you look out that window, you can see where the Battle of Matewan happened. It would be cool for people to actually look out that window. So we rotated basically what the chronological path would be to make that window the Matewan section. And then we left that window intact. And I just did this last summer. It's kind of hard to see exactly what's going on here, but this is a newer version. Originally, the window was just there and it just said what you were looking at. And then we got a small grant from the West Virginia Humanities Council. Chuck Keeney and I worked on revamping an exhibit that talked more about the Battle of Matewan, and then has a push button audio thing where the actor Chris Cooper, who plays the main character in the movie Matewan, reads a script that Chuck wrote, and the music and sound effects in the background were done by JJN Multimedia, which is another very local group that we've started working with for sound and video stuff. So that person is no longer on our team, but I like to point out the window thing in terms of the collaboration that we had with folks who are very intimately involved in the area in ways that I didn't grow up there. Establishing the Battle of Blair Mountain involves three sides: the Logan County quote unquote defenders, the King Coal Army, the Miners Army, and the US Army. So I picked different colors to work with them. This was a kind of wild artifact that we just got in the last couple of years. If you know the story of the Battle of Blair Mountain, as I referenced earlier, it involves the Unionist coal miners tying red bandanas on their arms or on their necks um, and eventually being called rednecks as a result of having done that, right? But the function of the red bandana on the battlefield was very practical in that there was no common uniform that everybody was wearing. So once you're in the woods, I mean, if you've ever hiked up into the Appalachian woods in the middle of summer, it's dense and it's difficult to see. Some of these photos, it just looks like the jungle. I mean, it is in a sense. These bandanas were to, so you knew who was on whose side. The guys coming out on the other side of the mountain, on the side of the coal companies, they had on white armbands. But this red paisley bandana that people were wearing at the time was so utterly commonplace that they're not really preserved. We didn't have one for the first 9 years that we were a museum, basically, because just none had come forward. I think people walked off the battlefield after the Battle of Blair Mountain and just kept blowing their noses on them and wiping sweat on them, and they weren't meant to last 100 years. But we were given this one by actually a guy that we met when we were working on our monuments project in Marmet. He would bring this to show people, and he eventually loaned it to us for exhibition and then gifted it to us once he saw the exhibition case that I made for it. That was actually a really powerful moment. He felt so impressed by that. This had been in his family, it had been his grandfather's, that he decided we should be the permanent caretakers. The only other red bandana that we know that was involved in the Battle of Blair Mountains at the State Museum on display in Charleston. And I took a kind of founding documents approach to the display of it. I was thinking about how the Declaration of Independence and all of these other founding documents are on display at the National Archive in DC, which I had never actually been to, but I'd seen photos of this and I thought, whoa, the red paisley bandana is kind of the founding document of the West Virginia Mine Wars in a manner of speaking. It has resonance today. I don't know if you guys saw some of the Bernie Sanders rallies that were happening in DC. People were wearing red bandanas. This was a big deal during the teachers' strikes in 2019 and 2020. It's a symbol, right, that I think a lot of us in the region know, but I see it spreading nationally as well. And then we also talk about the aftermath of the mine wars, which was a dark time before the United Mine Workers were able to kind of regain a foothold and gain some power nationally. And we talk about the memory. This section looks a little bit different now. I didn't have an updated picture. We have more stuff from the movie Mate One that I've integrated into this to talk about like how we deal with the memory of the mine wars as, people alive in the 21st century. But there was also some information about the archaeology and the fight to save the mountain itself and the battlefield area itself. I'm proud to say that we get a ton of school groups in now. We have lesson plans that are available for teachers to download for free and books that we loan to them for some of the reading guides that we've been developing around existing publications. But we also just get a lot of kids that come in on vans and school buses. And, for a history that was kept out of school textbooks for decades, I'm proud of the fact that kids come here constantly from all over the state to learn about history and are in this space doing that learning. Are there any questions before I kind of transition a little bit into the artifacts themselves?
Hey, Shaun, if you look in the chat, this is the voice
Mm-hmm.
coming at you out of nowhere.
Chat.
There's quite a few questions. I can read them to you if you'd like. The first one says, we have a lot of people that want to donate items for our museums. How do you handle the donations? And then there's a second part. Is this something you keep track of who owns each item, or do you consider it a donation and move on from there? That is from Joy Brown out of Kentucky.
Yeah, great question. We did a terrible job of tracking that information at first. And we've slowly been developing systems both for loans and for gifts. I'm going to talk a little bit about our archive, which ended up being, or our cataloging system, which ended up being the central um, tool for that. But in our old building, we joked that our archive was basically the back room where we also stored snacks, and there was a bathroom and that terrible water heater that I mentioned and a safe. I mean, it was just filing cabinets with things in them. The paperwork was always getting lost, what paperwork we had. So the system now involves, like, we have a loan form that I'd be happy to share with anyone who wants to see it. I can email it out after this workshop. And then we have a gift of deed, which is very similar. And both of these things are pretty standard for our museum. But the process of saying no, I think, is also critical to this, and I'm terrible at that. I need to find a way to. I can talk about it more if people are interested, but at the moment, it's difficult for me to say no because I kind of understand how much people treasure everything that they bring us. So, we have, for example, I have like this carbide headlamp, which anyone who's sort of lived in a coal mining community probably has one of these from their grandpa or whatever. We have like 24 of these, and we don't really need any more. But every time someone brings it in, it is in fact the light that was on their grandpa or great grandpa's head when they worked their entire life in the mine. So it does mean a lot to them, and that kind of magical element of things is difficult sometimes for me to say no to. But yes, we do now track everything, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we have some time as we move forward.
Would you like one more question?
Yeah, let's do that. I'm looking at them as well.
Okay. Maya says, I'd love to hear more about how you engaged current or former miners in designing the museum's layout. What was important to people? What kinds of ideas that emerged from that engagement were or are being integrated into the museum? For organizations interested in documenting and sharing public histories, what advice or learnings can you share about how to meaningfully utilize participatory documentation? Thanks for your question, Maya.
These are great questions, you guys. And I see there's also a lot of really thorough comments up top that I'm not meaning to ignore. But we, in terms of engaging with current and former miners, I would say we were mostly engaging with former miners just as a function of the fact that Local 1440 was like 90% retired at the time that the museum started, and now 100% retired, and that there are less union miners in the immediate area where we were working in Mingo. Not to say that we wouldn't talk to non-union miners, but just that, like, that didn't come into play. That did come into play a little bit later with our public monuments project. But in terms of the ideas that they had and what was important to them, to be honest, I think the first like 6 months that I came down to Mate One, I was just listening. Like, you guys are going to hear me talk constantly for the next hour and a half or so, because that's sort of what I'm doing today for and with you guys. But generally speaking, walking into the space, I didn't talk at all. I just did a lot of listening. And so things that happened had to do with simple stuff like painting the life in the coal camps area dark, coal mine like, but we're not trying to fake a coal mine because that felt too kitschy to me. Talking about the tools and the commonality of those tools to everybody and how they identified with the work through the tools that they used. I said earlier that there's a lot of coal mining museums, and there are, and then we all tend to have the exact same tools on display, which can feel repetitive to someone who's in it. But at the same time, like I was saying with those headlamps, those were very, very important to people. People who are living miners remember, for example, the heavy battery packs that they had on their hip from some of the very first electric headlights that they used. So it was just really a lot of listening to that kind of thing, and trying to come up with ways to tell those stories based on what we actually had in hand. I also want to say that a newer thing for us in the last 2 years has been to begin to collect oral histories. So we're working with a couple of young anthropologists who are very well versed in the oral history collecting part of the work that they do, and that's become more of an influence for us lately. Is there one more that I'm?
Yeah, there's interesting, hold on. Um, a woman named Melinda is on, who said, or is that Maya? Um,
It's me, Mel. Mel's
yeah,
fine.
would you like to introduce yourself and ask
Yeah,
your
you,
Sure.
question?
you kind of answered my question. So my mom grew up in Matewan, quite certain she was born there, but she grew up in the Romani encampments, and finding written history on Romani communities in Matewan, you'll find the word gypsy, which is a pejorative, if you
Yeah.
find anything at all. I've been kind of blessed in West Virginia side to find a decent amount of written records on us Romani people in West Virginia, but my family is mostly from Kentucky. So as my mom is aging, we've already lost my father, and she's, getting to that point where she's losing her faculties. What should I be doing to try to preserve some of her Matewan history? Just starting to just like record her stories?
Yeah, I mean that is bottom line the absolute easiest thing you can do, and thankfully like you can do it on a smartphone, and then save the MP3s. But um yeah, I mean I come into contact with a couple versions of what you're talking about in this work. One is the just the straight up audio recordings. There are tapes. I don't remember where they are, from the early 1980s, of interviews with people in Matewan at that time that are like the physical cassette tapes that have been digitized. And then the kind of work we do, it's straight digital. So we usually use a couple of digital recording devices that are like fancier than an iPhone that our anthropologists have, but the result is the same if you get into a nice quiet room. And then periodically we will find VHS videos or be given VHS videos where somebody did a video interview with somebody, their grandpa or whoever, because they had that. Um, and then sometimes transcriptions or summaries of those that are bound like a almost like a zine or a small self-published book. We have a growing collection in our reference library of there's like a section that's just small press books about small towns in West Virginia, because there's like so many of them, and every single one of them is put together by somebody like you who's just like, I got to preserve this history, or I got to start asking these people about this stuff before we lose them. And they don't have like a super wide audience, but the fact of even like getting something written down, in my mind, I'm a big fan of small press stuff anyway. But it, like, once you can put it on a shelf, that means anyone in a library can pick it up off that shelf. And I'll say, for example, like, I don't know anything about the Romani history in Mingo County, but I know about the Romani and I would love to learn more. If I stumbled across that book in a gift shop, I'd buy it just because I don't know. Um, Not to put a bunch of work on your plate. You asked what the first step was, and I think the first step is doing those recordings for sure.
Yeah, and then a little bit of a follow-up question, if that's okay. Have you, because, and I'm not Asian, I'm Romani, right? So indigenous nomadic ethnicity realm is where us Romani fall. But in trying to preserve my family's history, I've come across a lot of Asian communities in Kentucky and West Virginia that talked about there were tons of Asian miners in Matewan, and I didn't know that. Have you come across any of those histories, or the Black miners, the Asian miners, or any like ethnic minority minors that were part of this?
Black miners, yes. Asian, no. I'd never heard that. I had
Yeah,
never heard
I heard
that.
it a couple years ago and I kept hearing it from different people. I haven't been able to dive into it. It's not really my realm. History and anthropology is not my specialty. But yeah,
Sure.
I keep hearing that too. So I'm really concerned we're gonna lose these histories.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, I know I know a lot about the what union activity looked like all the way over on the west coast of the United States at the same time involved a lot of Chinese immigrants, as an example, working on the railroads and whatnot. And it's like, you look at photos in the same time period, like wholly different looking workforce. I'll say that like this reminds me of two things. One is the kind of like archival racism that existed at the time and that is sort of perpetuated by fact of like, I guess I want to say like who had their photo taken is like the first step, right? So if a whole crew of Black miners didn't have their photo taken, there's a lot of these crew photos where it's like everyone on the shift is kind of lined up. If those photos were taken, then were they preserved? If they were preserved, then were they sent to an institution that had the resources to continue preserving them, or were they kept in a family? I'm aware of some families that do not want to share their things with professional archives for reasons that I definitely understand, particularly Indigenous history, I think often is kind of, kept intra-community. But those things are big hurdles for, and I'll also say like we deal with a lot of like Western and Eastern European immigration where when you're looking at a black and white photo, if you don't have any names, you don't have any other information, it's just kind of like, I don't know, I guess it looks like a bunch of white guys. Maybe that guy looks Italian. Like you just don't even know in some cases. And that,
Yeah, and blending in with survival. So like the whole point was for
yes,
us to try to, pass as white or whitish.
yes, yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, so it's like unless you have notes or something came straight from a family, we don't know. I've had several experiences with people contacting us to ask like what objects we have that belong to Black miners, and it's like I don't know. Maybe some of them, but if they came to us randomly, we don't know. I also want to say like I remember that when I talk about the documentation of or the process of having eliminated the mine wars history specifically from textbooks, one of the documentations of that is a series of letters between, I think, I might screw this up because I'm terrible with names. I think Homer Holt was the governor of West Virginia at the time, but in any case, it's letters between him and the guy who the Works Progress Administration had hired to write the book about West Virginia when the WPA was writing history books about every state in the United States. Then Homer Holt came on real hard about his inclusions of Mother Jones and the mine wars and a photo of a Mexican coal miner. There were like 3 or 4 things that he said you absolutely need to take this out of this book, and one of them was this photo of this Mexican coal miner, which for me was the first time I'd ever heard about a worker coming up to West Virginia from Mexico, and I never have since really heard much about that history. So Holt's point was we don't want to talk about, I mean, it was a racist point. We don't want to talk about these other people who were working in the mines at this time. There's a different story that we want to tell. But when I first came across that, it was a very sideways way that I learned, like, my God, there were Mexican coal miners here, at least at some point, or at least there was this one guy. So, oh, Ramani's superstitious about having your photo taken. Yeah, sure, definitely. Also that.
Shaun, if you want one more question before you move on, Bill
Yeah,
did
let's
ask,
do it.
back when you were having your slideshow going, he said, I see the
Bull Moose
machine
special.
gun displayed. Maybe details on the Bull Moose special.
Yeah, so the Bull Moose special was a boxcar that was outfitted with a lot of steel armor and a machine gun and several slits to point other types of guns out of, that was built during the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes. And this boxcar was attached to, I'm trying to remember all of the details of this. I believe it was attached to a single train engine, and they would drive it by these tent colonies where people were living who were unionist coal miners and their families. They would drive by these tent colonies and strafe them at night with this machine gun and their rifles and whatnot. This so, and they called that the Bull Moose Special, that particular formation, that armed train. A couple things about that. One is that the railroad was a little bit above, like you can't, I a friend of mine who was a machine gunner in the US Army more recently in Afghanistan was trying to explain to me how like you don't point a machine gun down on the tripod, or there's some mounting thing where the stories that people told were that the machine guns strafed across the top of all their tents and put holes in the tops of their tents. And he was saying, oh, it's just because you can't turn it down. But they would terrorize people with this thing. One of our anthropologists, who is more specifically an archaeology PhD, has been doing some digs in the town of Holly Grove. I went out and helped him with one. And this is a great segue to archaeology, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Holly Grove is one of the main places that we know about where the Bull Moose Special was used to terrorize people, and he's started digging in that community. And that's been super cool because we're meeting people. Like we were out there for 2 or 3 days last summer, and everybody driving by is very, very small community. Everybody driving by was like, y'all doing okay? Need any water? Like, what are you guys up to? And so that's a fun, like people just like that you're out there with a shovel and a tent. People are like, huh, and everybody also had a story about some arrowheads that they found or some bullets that they found when they grew up, so it is a nice way to kind of bring the museum's work into a public setting as well. That machine gun that you saw is not from the era because we were donated a slightly later model of the Browning 1919, which functionally hasn't changed in a very long time, but that machine gun in 1921 looked a little bit different, and like we still can't afford it. There are collectors, as you can imagine, that will buy all the guns, all the old guns. So any gun that we get is donated to us or is a replica. And that machine gun is a replica. So I catch hell sometimes because it's like not quite the right one. But the label says that. I talk about that in the label. Was a good example maybe of trying to tell a story when you don't have exactly the right thing, but you still want to tell it. What I talk about in the label is that the exact mechanism that made it a machine gun, which is a tool that only kills people, hasn't actually changed in over 100 years. So digging more into the objects and digging quite literally, a significant amount of our holdings, the objects that we have, come from this man, Kenny King. Kenny has been walking around the Blair Mountain battlefield since the early 1990s with a metal detector, digging up things in the battlefield and generating a fuller picture of the story of the specifics of the Battle of Blair Mountain in the process of doing that. So he worked in the mid 1990s. He took a group from WVU down there to establish some of the relevance of the work that he was doing, and to establish that there were in fact ammunition casings in the ground there. And then worked with a group, a local archaeologist who's not working in the field anymore, named Brandon Nida, as well as Harvard Ayers, who was an archaeology professor at Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina, to do more comprehensive surveys of this stuff in the early 2000s. I want to say 2008 and 2009. Those stories, that sort of people's archaeology, is really what helped shape our understanding of the battle itself, which, when the narrative did come into public, was often told by the companies as like, well, it was a bunch of hillbillies that were just shooting into the woods. They were mad about the wrong things. They certainly weren't organized. This tells a story of how organized the Redneck Army actually was, and kind of specifically shows us their movements, and shows us that like all the people on the miners' side literally just showed up with whatever guns they had. Some of them squirrel hunting guns, some of them very high powered rifles that they got out of a Sears catalog, some of them their issued Army rifles. And the guys on the other side that were shooting machine guns down the side of the mountain at them had access to very high grade equipment and consistent equipment, which just further, I'm not like a gun guy, but I've become a gun guy through this work simply because like firearms are a pivotal piece of this story. And so I've learned a lot about them through doing this work. So I can talk about these old guns a lot. That's one thing that like when I was like 20 years old and studying art, I wasn't really thinking I'd get into, but they're pivotal to the story that we tell. And specifically Kenny's work pulling metal things out of the ground. This is a rifle that was used in the battle that was buried. The miner that was sort of evacuating the battlefield at this time. A lot of people hid their guns in the trees and under logs and things like that, so they go back and get them later so they wouldn't be confiscated by the army. And this gun was never reclaimed. It's in Winchester, 1873, and the wooden stock and whatnot all rotted off. So it's just the metal pieces that we have now. So for the person who asked about, and I'm sorry I've forgotten your name, who asked about how we track things, I'm, if it's not already obvious, like super detail oriented and like kind of systems oriented. And so when we started cataloging things, we started photographing everything that came in and logging that stuff in a catalog and storing it in this room, this research room that we now have in the new building that we built out. So after the museum itself was built and we opened it in late 2020, we then turned around and did our first run of documentation. The Appalachian photographer Roger May came in and worked with us, photographed everything that was on exhibit and everything that was in storage, and set the standard for how the photographs would be done moving forward. So that I followed Roger's advice when I came in and started documenting the archaeological stuff. We had 3 boxes of things from those archaeology digs that I mentioned in 2009 and 8, photographing all of that stuff so that we would have some way in which a future researcher could get all that information in one place and then go pull it off the shelf if they needed to. The nicer museums that I worked at when I was a bit younger all had this huge system for tracking this stuff, and often had cooler stuff, or it felt like they had cooler stuff in storage than they had on the floor, because that's where you'd go down there and find like a crazy vase next to like a doll from 200 years ago or something. That'd all be on the shelf. Doing that work made us realize that we were no longer collecting simply things from the West Virginia mine wars, but that we were collecting things that were from the community, generally speaking, as it related to the unions and the coal mines and life in the area. So I used to kind of think, I mean, I was really naive 10 years ago when we first started. I thought, okay, we'll open this museum and then people are just going to show up with cool stuff. It didn't happen much for several years. I think people really needed to kind of, and it's going to sound obvious when I say it now, but they really needed to kind of learn whether we were people that could be trusted with these things. Because, you know, in this case, for example, the orange helmet is a good friend of mine's dad's helmet that he donated to us. This is kind of what our catalog looks like on the back end. And then there's a public facing side of it, which is similar. It's maybe a lot more detail than you would want as a casual browser, but I try to put every single thing in there. I've gone back with Kenny recently and asked him to verify where he found some of the archaeological stuff, just so that I'm able to preserve those locations and the stories around him finding them for whoever may be interested in the future to be able to reference. We use a piece of software called Catalog It, which was basically built by museum nerds who kind of wanted a piece of software that was more easy to use than some of the existing stuff that was out there. and also cloud-based and cross-platform, so you didn't need to run it solely on a PC. And it's a lot less expensive than some of the other software. So the photography is either mine or Roger's, and then all the data entry is mine. And this gave us a really great opportunity to create some online exhibits, which, you know, in an effort to kind of keep from gatekeeping some of the stuff that's in storage, which is, I mean, literally probably 3/4 of our holdings are in storage. And only about 1/4 of it's out on the floor in an exhibition. We've got all of these online exhibits that people can explore, which aren't like, you know, we usually try to get a guest writer, we'll make a video about it, whatever. At the end of the day, you're kind of just scrolling through the objects themselves. But I will say I'm proud of the fact that I think we have the largest online collection of company script of anyone, just for the sake of having like sat down and photographed all of it and put it all out there. So, you know, like for any student who's interested in learning about company script, or anybody who's like, I wonder if they have the script from my town here, we've got all of that online. So that's actually kind of the other side of the museum, is all of the objects that we manage and the way in which they're shown. I am going to talk about one more thing, and then I'm going to take us out of slideshow land, and we'll just talk, and we'll do the activity if you guys want. When we were working on Courage in the Hollers, which is our public monument project, the first phase of that, we worked in a community called Clothier, which is pretty close to Blair Mountain itself, and we worked in Marmette near Charleston. There's a whole process to when we built those monuments that I'm not going to get into, but I'll say one of the pieces of it was that we were building interpretive panels for people to, like, you know, anybody, tourists or whoever, to come up and read about the Battle of Blair Mountain, and then read about why Marmette was significant to the Battle of Blair Mountain. And at a certain point, we'd been working with the same community members for several months, and we were asking them about like photos, local photos and objects that they had, which we could include on these interpretive panels. And we ran into this situation, which I think is quite common, which is a lot of people didn't have that documentation, or they might have the photos, or they knew somebody that did. But the way that those things get shared for most people is like low resolution images that are shared on Facebook, you know, shared in like locally specific Facebook groups, or genealogy groups. You know, people are scanning them to put on ancestry.com or things like that. Or they just don't have the tools. They don't have a scanner. They have an iPhone photo of it. For our purposes, blowing it up to be on an interpretive panel, it was actually really difficult to get that stuff. A high enough resolution, a crisp enough image. So we're working on redesigning those panels for phase 2 of that project. But we built this thing called Community Archiving Days, which we worked with the folks at Black in Appalachia to just kind of talk to them about some of the community archiving work that they do. And we hosted a series of these events where we drove around in a van and went to different libraries. I think we did 6 or 7 of them total in 1 week, which was exhausting. And we showed up, and people were allowed to bring their stuff, and we would do an interview with them. This is the kind of diagram that I made of how the system worked so that we could share it out to people. People would come in, we would do an oral history interview with them. I was working the imaging station, so I was photographing everything and scanning everything. Roger May came back into play and was doing portraits of people with their things. All of this documentation, the recordings and the images, were then shared back to those people. So they had the opportunity to tell their stories, but also have somebody take relatively professional photographs, high-res photos, high-res scans of their things. And then, and this is absolutely critical, there was a table full of free food and drink. Anytime you're doing a community thing, feed people, feed people. It's awesome to show up when there's free lunch. People settle in, they'll start talking to you about stuff. We actually, one of the things that happened through this project is that we got hold of a very rare photo that no one had ever seen of a machine gun nest at the Battle of Blair Mountain, that came to us through a woman who had basically collected everything out of the basement of a coal company that her mom had worked at before they demolished the building. And a lot of the other stuff that people brought in was pretty similar to the other holdings that we have, but we didn't take their things unless they very specifically wanted to donate to us. It was primarily about giving people the tools to share their own history more clearly in terms of how they were able to show people photographs and stuff. But a few things did make their way into our collection, including that photograph that I mentioned. These are a few of my favorite things, but particularly that photo of the woman with a cat, because I think of cats as like a very like internet, like I'm always looking at pictures of the internet cats, and here's one from, you know, like decades and decades ago. But that process at Community Archiving Days for us was kind of the first time that we began to spread that collection work out into communities and start to talk to people about, you know, again, just sort of assert that the stories that they tell have a lot of relevance, and assert that we want to be involved in that stuff. We're out of slideshow land. Would be cool to see you guys' faces, but I understand if you don't want to. I see Bill. I'm open to questions. We can just chat. I know some more stuff came through the chat, and then we can talk about storytelling with objects if you guys want to get into that. It's 2:15 now. We got till 3, so there's some time. Casey, I've lost track of where I was.
Sure. Well,
The
Bill just
question.
posed another question. He said, can you talk a bit about the pros and cons working with local historic societies?
I've worked with them in my own research. I'm actually trying to think. So it can be maybe a little bit territorial. I think there's been a little bit of like, you know, most of the time, if somebody is a multi-generational resident of an area, and then like, you know, when we came in on Community Archiving Days, for example, it's kind of like, who the hell are these guys? But to be honest with you, it comes back to like just walking into the room open-mindedly. Like our director Kenzie is great at just like blowing into a room and making everybody feel comfortable. She does a lot of stuff that like I couldn't do. She's born and raised in the region and knows how to talk to everybody, and that alone actually has been really helpful, wedging open the door for like, you know, a weirdo like me to walk in with a scanner and be like, I'm just the guy with the scanner. You know what I mean? Like, so if somebody's kind of the front person to open that door, that's been really helpful. I feel like, can you elaborate on that question a little bit? Because I want to make sure I address it, but I don't.
Yeah, hi.
Hey.
So we are thinking about renovating an old historic grist mill in our community to something else, and we're thinking about maybe a history representation and a history museum. We have some historical documents and historical archives in the grist mill itself. Our local historic society seems to be a bit interested in collaborating with the local community group that's trying to do this, but time seems to be a factor, a consideration for him, and I'm not sure he will go along with the ideal of another location besides his historical society to house things, archives in it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how I would approach that. I mean, it's like we are, as a team, a little bit allergic to like when something seems like it may be run by like a single individual who kind of has domain over something like that. Not, out of disrespect, but just out of a bit of caution on the exact things that you're talking about. I think, I don't have a direct experience with having like actually gotten into friction with them, because in Mate One we've been lucky, and most of the history keepers just wanted to work with us, and we didn't have a competing institution. There is the Mate One Depot Museum, but it isn't really positioned to tell the stories that we tell. And the Hatfield McCoy stories are kind of like adjacent, so that we're not in competition with those. One thing that we do, or that we said we were doing, especially at the beginning, was to kind of say, well, we're in this channel, like our lane is Mine Wars. And so, I don't know if the grist mill has a lane that's slightly different than that guy's lane, but maybe that's a way to start, where you're not stepping on toes. But it can be hard to, and my inclination is always to just invite people in, and it's not actually always the best idea, because then you got someone on your team that you might not enjoy working with, or that might be disruptive. That's a tough part of community work, I think. Yeah, is that helpful at all?
I think so. I hear just being open and seeing what his thoughts are. So I think that's the beginning of our potential collaboration, would be just to go talk to them, and also not try to think making sure he doesn't think we're trying to supplant his efforts in his history museum, but as a addendum to it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I might even just ask him the question at that lunch or meeting or whatever, just like, how do we not step on your toes?
Yeah.
Just being fully honest like that. Yeah.
Okay. I'm seeing Melinda. Melinda, I'd like to catch up with you sometime and talk about
Yeah,
your
absolutely.
experience.
Yeah. We
Okay.
had an issue similar to that, and the way we got it through, I mean, it took forever, but it's a hybrid. Part of it, the part of the building that was the most structurally sound and that we could get past code, basically, that was the community center, which is a very small portion of the building. And then the rest was pretty much like, a living museum, basically.
Okay. Shaun, tell the whole team down there in Maitland that I said hi.
I will. I will. Thanks for
Okay.
coming to the workshop. What else do we have in the, I'm scrolling up and down on this to see if
I think the one thing that we missed, Shaun, was Sasa, who had to leave early.
saw
She
that.
did say that she is in doing work diving into the history of the mine wars. She's in research mode. She spent much of her childhood in Paint Creek, and she would love to form a collaboration with you. So I posted your email in the chat. Hopefully she grabbed that. I've
Cool.
also, if people want to add their emails to the chat, I will make sure that they get shared with you.
Yeah, that'd be great. I lost track of who I said I would share the loan and gift of deed forms with, but I'm happy to do that after the call. I said the call. I'm on so many Zoom meetings after the workshop. But yeah, that's totally fine, sharing my contact. So I don't know how many people got the prompt, but I had added a prompt to this workshop just a couple of weeks ago, where I asked people to bring a thing to this. And this is a bit of an experiment to me, because we're not in person. And I think it's always, we'll see how it goes. But I wonder if anyone brought something to the workshop. My idea was that we could all kind of brainstorm how to tell a story around that object. I have one, but if anyone brought anything or even saw the prompt, does anybody have anything? My house is full of tiny things on shelves. It's a compromise between me and my partner how many of those tiny things on shelves there are. So I have a lot of that stuff. I see a red bandana. Do you want to talk about that one, Bill?
This is just one I picked up the last visit to the museum that I was at. So I had it hanging on my bookshelf behind me, and I thought that's an artifact.
It is, or it will be soon. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think, the bandana, circling back to that, was a really interesting experience when I got to deal with the one that we have as an object, because so I do a lot of the mount making and case building here in Pittsburgh at home. So that means that I sometimes am driving, with an old Winchester rifle in the back of my car, or something that I'm taking home to clean up, or in that case, a red bandana that was like, really threadbare and a very delicate thing. One of the things that I've never really been very good at articulating is that I feel like the part of me that's an artist when I'm doing this is the part of me that is interested in the kind of magical space, for lack of a better term, between something just being like an everyday thing like the bandana, and suddenly being something more than that, because I said all of a sudden this was worn by someone who marched to the Battle of Blair Mountain. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something that, like, uh Catholics do this with relics, like, here's a tooth from this saint or a hair from this person, and that specific thing suddenly is freighted maybe with the importance of where it came from. That's really exciting to me, and I feel like um the knowing, like, having that bandana in my house for a couple of months while I built that kind of wacko Declaration of Independence, like, exhibition case, was felt really special. And to be honest, a lot of the stuff that we have, again, I came from, it was especially when I worked at the Carnegie Museum of Art. All the stuff that we had was like really, really, came from wealthy people. A lot of it, very, like, kind of upmarket collectibles or paintings that had gained a lot of um, uh, value, that people had invested in. I mean, it was kind of this whole world of objects that were all, like, intentionally rarefied. And so I think when you're working with people's history, there's something really beautiful about, like, taking something that feels actually maybe commonplace. Like, I see this photo of like a horseshoe and a railroad spike, but I missed those are technically very commonplace things, but then, like, elevating them in the context of a museum feels like a kind of special sort of magical thing to do with them. Again, I'm using the word magic because, as I said, I'm not very good at articulating precisely what that is, but it's kind of like a feeling that I like working with. Do you want to talk about those, Melinda?
Yeah, here they are on camera live. Sorry, I'm not very camera ready myself today.
That's
But
okay.
yeah, this railroad spike in particular, I've tried to keep it wrapped up. The horseshoe is pretty common, but I don't know. I feel like the railroad spike in particular is awfully meaningful to me. This was my dad's. He had it just like in a shoebox, and the shoebox had permanent marker written on it, mate one stuff. So it's just like
No
so funny
way.
that, yeah, this is what we found in his cabin, and everyone in the family is like, no one wants that. I'm like, I want that. Are you serious? I want that. So
Yeah,
yeah, I
absolutely.
took this row. It's like I've had it for 3 years now, just in a drawer wrapped up.
You know what's funny? I actually have I also have a railroad spike that when I first went down to Matewan, I grabbed, and then like I was sitting drinking beer. This is like 10 years ago. I first got involved, and I had a Dremel, and I was like dremeling the word Matewan into it like a nerd. I didn't know that I'd ever go back. I was like, I didn't know I'd be doing this work 10 years later. So I was like, I'm gonna make my own souvenir. Um, there's probably millions of these in the US, but it's special that that one is one that your dad held as a souvenir. What would you do with it if you were going to like hang it in your house, for example?
So
Or what do
right
other people
now,
think?
it stays wrapped up in a drawer in this like apothecary cabinet with all of my. I mean, I've got people's baby teeth in this cabinet, so that's like another human teeth here that I'm like, I don't know, what do we do with this weird stuff? It's just very Appalachian, like it's just very Appalachian. I have locks of hair too, and again, everything's just kept wrapped up and stored in this apothecary cabinet that's like right in our living room right now. I would like maybe to make a shadow box of the regions. I was thinking of trying so all the baby teeth, finding out the main area they lived in. If they stayed in Louisa, Kentucky, make a Louisa shadow box. If they stayed in
Yeah,
Huntington, West Virginia, make a Huntington shadow box. So that's kind of my plan right now, but I'm open to suggestions.
I love that. Yeah, I there is a world of um prefab like souvenir display stuff that I've plumbed a lot for our work at the Mine Wars Museum because it's only been in the last few years that we actually had enough money to start to get um, some other types of materials. But I'll say like all of the if you're looking at our cases, I'll pull up a picture here. Um, and I know I'm not screen sharing here. I want to pull it up first, but if you look at inside all of our cases, the lighting, where are you guys at? The lighting is just like little LEDs from Amazon. You see those two kind of tiny spotlights on sticks? And those are just a lot happened in LED technology since we first opened the museum in 2015. And so, I mean, these are actually like very, very inexpensive, like jewelry case lights that I bought just like several dozen of. And then I spray painted them black because I didn't like that they were chrome silver. And now they look like professional museum lighting stuff. But to be totally honest with you, there's quite a bit of that kind of thing that's not very expensive that's available online. We have a shadow box that I don't have a photo of that I bought, specifically for that, for like an Oddfellows sash that we have in our collection.
Our biggest problem with the shadow boxes is our walls are plaster.
Oh,
And
I have
so
that too. Yeah.
yeah, so like that's we have live in a very old house, so like we had to demolish part of the wall to get to some plumbing, and you could find the
Oh my
horsehair
God.
that's stuffed into the
Yes.
yeah the slab. I'm like, oh great, this is horsehair, cool, and newspaper and stuff.
You
So
can't do
that's the
anything with that
thing.
stuff once you
I
break it. Yeah,
know that's
yeah.
the problem. Like if we do this wrong, if we don't reinforce it, it's gonna fall off the wall.
So okay, so hardware. This is important.
Yeah.
So our house is a was built in like 1900 in Pittsburgh. It's just like we live in the Bloomfield neighborhood. If anyone's ever been here, it's just like a lot of working class row homes, wood or brick, and we all have that ancient plaster that like if you were to just bump a hole in it, it just sheds, it comes flying out. I just replaced a bunch of windows in our house 2 weeks ago, and in the places where we had to redo the wood, it was just like, yeah, all that hair, right? And so we're really good friends with our next door neighbor who moved in just a couple of years ago, and she's forever asking me like, I just want to hang this painting on the wall, like is there like a way to do this? Two things I recommend are if something's not that heavy, is to just get very basic. This might be something where I have to send you a link, but very, very basic photo hanging nail brackets that will hold the nail so see if this makes sense. The nail goes into the wall like that, but the bracket braces against the nail. These walls can hold that. There's a brand I like called Ook, OOK, that you see at Home Depot sometimes, and those are a slightly more specialized version of the same thing. Those will put something in your wall and usually hold it there. Outside of that, if I have to hang something heavier and I'm not using a butterfly screw, because also there's that cedar lath behind the plaster that bounces. Have you ever had that experience? You're trying to hammer something in
Yep.
and it's
The
bouncing.
bathroom, the plumbing, we had
Yep.
to pretty much build a wall inside the wall to mount the pipes because the pipes
Yeah.
are just loose in the wall.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, this is not gonna work.
This is great. I didn't think we'd be talking about this, but this is very relatable. So the other thing that I've used in some situations where I've had to hang heavier things, or like towel racks, which, you know, I may grab or something. There's a type of anchor that looks like a very wide, very tapered screw, and they come in plastic and metal, and you actually drive them into the wall by hand slowly with like a Phillips head screwdriver, with a large Phillips head, like a #3. And then when you get it into the plaster, you then put a normal screw into that anchor. And those are pretty good because they disperse the weight of the screw that you're putting in there for like hanging some heavier stuff. Happy to advise. I'm very lucky that I actually remember when Kenzie was asking me about the walls that we were building for the new museum, she's like, what's your ideal? And I was like, well, 3/4 inch plywood behind absolutely everything would be great. We can't afford that, but I'm just saying that since you asked, like 3/4 ply. Well, we don't have that. All the walls are totally hollow. Most stuff is not hung on studs in the museum because like I can't, it couldn't be designed that way. So there's a lot of funky anchoring stuff, but to be honest, the aisle at Home Depot for that stuff is like pretty comprehensive. But I'm happy to advise if you want to shoot me an email about any of that.
Yeah, it's so funny because people are like, why don't you have mirrors in your house? I'm like, because they can't hang on anything. They're too
Yeah,
heavy. We have
yeah,
one mirror in the bathroom, that's all you get.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know what you mean. Um, Anybody else have any objects that you want to talk about, or anecdotes, or house repair question? I will say that your box with the horseshoe and the railroad spike reminded me, my wife's grandmother passed away last summer, and she lived to be 103, which is possible. And she lived by herself up until then, although she had a lot of in-home aid for the last few years. And so I went with the family to do the kind of initial sorting of all of her stuff. And that was a really interesting, you know, I knew grandma, and I loved her. I wasn't as close to her as everybody else in the room was. So it was a very much more emotional experience for the other family members who came, um, to sort through this stuff. And I had a kind of removed perspective, as well as like I sort through a lot of old stuff constantly. So I was sort of looking through all of her things. One of the things that I pulled that I thought I'd show you guys if you didn't bring anything was, this is her husband fought in the Spanish Civil War in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. It's very difficult for me to get my camera to focus on this, but this is like he was in the Communist Party for a little while when he was in his 20s and early 30s, in the 1930s and 40s. He fought in the Spanish Civil War, and then he fought with the U.S. Army in World War II. And I had seen some of his stuff from the Spanish Civil War, which is not an event that a lot of Americans learn that much about. But and he wasn't Spanish. There was a group of volunteers that came from all over internationally, but there was a group that came over from the United States, most of whom were communists at that time, to fight the fascists. And I found this in a drawer, and I just thought, like, you know, she had all this other stuff from his time in Spain that was much more specific to the Spanish countryside, and the other kind of like various sort of like photographs and things like that. A lot of people will throw away. I've had the experience a lot of times when researching things that are very specifically politically like far left in the United States, where people have thrown away the evidence of that at various times in US history because it, you know, a family member will find it and just be like, this, you know, this is weird. This is weird stuff. It's not worth preserving, or they don't agree with it, or it's a dirty word or whatever. I'm a fan of saving everything. But I thought that was a really cool thing because it's actually very cheaply made. I'm not even really sure what its function was, because it looks like it may have hung as a button or something, but it also looks like these things. I grew up making these Christmas decorations where you would get a metal, you know, these kind of inexpensive metal frames with a design in it, and you would melt these plastic beads in them to make, I mean, this is like a 1980s thing, but it kind of looks like that, like you'd fill in with the color, except this one is hand painted. I don't know if anyone would have preserved this if I hadn't grabbed it out of grandma's. It was in her nightstand, along with his dog tags from World War II. Although I don't think they really started using dog tags. He had some ID tags with his original name on, which he had changed around that time because he was also a union organizer, and he was organizing in some places where it was dangerous, so he went under a false name. So yeah, that's an object I brought. I don't know how I would display it, but I just thought I'd show it to you guys because you mentioned finding your dad's stuff, and I think that's particularly special.
Yeah, I think the biggest recommendation I can have for everyone is to take water damage very seriously, because we lost so much. Like, a lot of the old hats he had saved from mining days, a lot of the old flannels and the bandanas and stuff.
Mm.
So much of that we had to get rid of because the mold, it just check in on your older relatives and just see if they need some storage totes. I would recommend, because we're not gonna, I mean, we can't change their ways, right? But see if you can just get them to put some things in some airtight containers while they're still here and with us.
Yeah, that's a good point, to be honest. I mean, most people aren't walking around with a bunch of like high grade archival cardboard boxes in their closet with their stuff. Everything's in, you know, well, you're lucky if it's in a plastic tote, you know. Like you're saying. I was just reading an interview with Chad Hunter, who's the director of the archives at Apple Shop, and he was talking. He actually lives outside of Pittsburgh now, so we've been talking a little bit more recently. But he was talking about when they had their flood. You know, they had never really. A lot of photographs were damaged, as well as digital media, and so there was a completely different disaster, like first response to keeping the film and the photographs stored than there was to keeping the later stuff like VHS cassettes and anything digital stored for conservation. So they, for example, ended up just wrapping up and freezing all of their film and photographs, because that's first line of defense for those things until you can get to them. But with the VHS and some of the other digital stuff, they absolutely needed to dry them out as soon as possible. I don't have a conservation background. I've just worked with conservators before, but you know, even some of that stuff is a little bit counterintuitive. I'd never heard about throwing a bunch of wet photos in the freezer, but apparently, if you catch it soon enough, you know, that's how you can preserve those things. Newspapers are kind of their own thing. I mean, we have a lot of newspapers in our collection, but when we exhibit them, we exhibit like a scan and a reprint, a facsimile, because newspapers are made. I mean, I think toilet paper may be the only other like least likely thing to survive more than a decade. And I mean, I was told that at the State Museum that they basically try to scan or photograph their newspapers and just get rid of the originals because they can be kind of a liability to store in terms of fire. But they also just fall apart. All of our newspapers are falling apart. And they just do that.
I also can't stress mothballs, how important mothballs are. Like I even just like a glass jar with some mothballs in it and putting little fabric pieces in that. It's so helpful.
Smell terrible. A particular association with that smell, but you're right. My partner and I have been fighting a cold war against wool moths for about 9 years in our house, and we have not yet won. We're trying our hardest, but yeah, they will destroy things that you enjoy.
I think we have an idea for our next workshop, which is how to conserve
Just
artifacts.
Skillshare, yeah, basic stuff. It's true. Yeah, yeah. I could
Bill,
help
go
run
ahead.
that.
I was wondering, Shaun, if you found much luck in working with the state archives in Charleston, and what their attitude toward Blair Mountain, particularly the history of Blair Mountain.
That's an interesting question. So in the very beginning, I assumed that they might not take us very seriously, but I didn't ask, to be fair. I didn't know anybody there. I had an experience here in Pittsburgh where I had done a public history project, and the Heinz History Center here, which is our Smithsonian affiliate, kind of the central authority on Southwest Pennsylvania history. It's a good museum, but they really kind of were adversarial towards our project, and I found that to be really disappointing. Although I did meet a lot of the labor history people here as a result of that, which was helpful. The State Museum in Charleston has done what a lot of museums have done, which was create an exhibition that showed both sides of the story. And I think that that's fine. And also, I don't think objectivity is really, I'm less interested in an objective telling of working class history, because I think that the industrial side of the history is already being told and is already the history that a lot of us grow up with. And so, I think I wouldn't say that the West Virginia Mine Wars is like a both sides kind of museum. But I can tell you that we have toured state police cadets through there as part of their training, because they decided that they wanted to bring them there and learn about the formation of the state police, which happened during the Mine Wars era. And that, those guys didn't come in and get offended by how communist our museum was or whatever. We're not anti-police, so I think the State Museum has a much more balanced and kind of having stepped back from the perspective of the individual working class people and the union. And we don't really do that. We focus a lot more on how hard things were for people because of anti-union activity and because of the private police forces and because of industry pressure. So as our museum continued to grow and exist, we had a guy on our board for a while who worked in the archives there. And they've always been in the archive side of things, very supportive of anything that we needed from them in terms of giving us access to reproductions with no questions asked. And so I think the sum result is they are an ally, as is the Eastern Regional Coal Archive and the West Virginia and Regional History Center at WVU. We have a lot of respectful relationships with them now. Librarians are usually awesome. Archivists are usually awesome and down to talk about stuff. I think that there's a lot more compromises that probably happened on the exhibition side of things that I was just never privy to. When you're in those big institutional spaces and there's a lot of potential funding coming from various sources, those sources can sometimes kind of dictate the outcome of exhibitions. And we don't have that pressure, but I have worked for museums where I watched that pressure at play. I saw it at the Heinz History Center several years ago when they were doing an exhibition about a series of coal mine collapses that happened here in Southwest Pennsylvania in the early 1900s. And there was like Consol Coal had funded a lot of the exhibition, and they wanted to make sure that it didn't come across as anti-coal, because this was at a time when there was a lot of public discourse about coal-fired power plants and mountaintop removal, and they didn't want the exhibit to like deal with coal in a way that they felt like was negative, which you know, I mean, I saw the exhibit and it was well done, and I didn't feel like it was one way or another, but I think that those kind of background influences definitely come into play, and if I had to guess, came into play in their Blair Mountain exhibit. But
Just a real quick aside. I grew up in West Virginia since I was 12, and went to high school in the early 1970s, took West Virginia history. Didn't know there was nothing in the history about Blair Mountain. And I had to go to college and take labor history from John David, great professor at the time, and where I learned about Blair Mountain for the first time. So yeah, history is too often silenced, and I'm afraid that's where we're headed to. Not to get political, but to this current administration.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, I mean, I never expected, I'm very nerdy about and interested in historical markers and monuments and public things like that, as well as museums. And I sort of never thought that that would be a thing that like most people would talk about, but it is in fact like a major part of the kind of culture war atmosphere that we find ourselves in right now. I think you're right. You know, whether you can put the toothpaste back in the tube at this point, I don't know. I mean, it kind of remains to be seen, but it is true that governments have manipulated how history is taught and shared in other parts of the world. Historically, it's a major tool. If people don't understand where they've been, they don't know how to imagine a future. And so I think your story about growing up in public school in West Virginia, not learning about the mine wars, is one that I've heard a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I learned about it from the movie Matewan, because I walked into a video store when we had those, and there was one on my block that had a lot of DVD. The guy that ran it specialized in like films from other countries and kind of just like independent film and weird stuff and animation. And I saw this movie Matewan sitting there that I didn't know how to pronounce, and my girlfriend at the time was like, we should watch this, it's, you know, it looks cool, it's kind of about around here. And I was like, all right, you know. And like I said, it's kind of a bummer, but it's also great. I was like, oh, James Earl Jones is in this. This is cool, you know. And that's how I learned about the mine wars. That was probably 2007 or 8, but I had read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States and several other things about US history and never come across it from you know, writers who were really concerned about labor history and working class history. So someone has to really care and bring it up front and continue to push the story.
I feel like that's so common with Appalachian history in general, because I talk to people all the time about how Appalachia, the region, is one of the most underserved and neglected in terms of like financial power from our government. Like, we are the last to get any sort of aid responses. And yet the surveys have been done by community-based researchers, so the actual people that are on the ground that also have some academic training. We are seeing time and time again that Appalachia has the most mutual aid networks. So I always point that out to people. I'm like, we are the most well-resourced in terms of our people power, our people helping people, but we are the most neglected by government and all these other entities.
I couldn't say it better. Yeah. Yeah. It's I mean, I lead a little bit of a dual life between my life here in Pittsburgh and my life in Mingo County, but it's been like really kind of an honor to have been allowed into that space and be, you know, allowed to build trust in that community and to do this kind of memory work there. Because, you know, I mean, I even have Pittsburgh's a town that's been, you know, kicked in the nuts quite a bit over the last several decades, but it's still, you know, like we have access to a lot here. And so even some of my friends, most of my friends here have still never been down to Mingo County to see the museum because it's not we're not right off the interstate in Matewan, you know, you have to really try to get there. And I'm like constantly amazed to this day at the people in the communities that I've met down there. Casey, we actually made it to 3 o'clock pretty much. Can you believe
well
it?
done, well
Just
done. I was
chatting.
just gonna say we should probably try and wrap things up, but Shaun, I really appreciate everything that you shared with us today. Thank you so much.
Y'all are very welcome.
Yeah, and I have collected the couple emails from the chat that were shared, and I will email them to you. And I shared your email in the chat, and so hopefully there are. Oh, there's one more from Joy. Thanks, Joy. Some connections made. And for anybody interested, there are some more workshops tomorrow that you can see. Going back into the lobby and bookmarking them if anyone's interested. So. Thank you again, Shaun, and thank you everyone who has been participating.
Glad to be here. Don't hesitate to reach out if you want to talk about how to hang photos in old plaster or anything like that. Down to chat. It's great to meet you all for a couple hours and spend the afternoon with you.
You as well. Everybody have a wonderful afternoon.
Cool. Take care.
Take care.